So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. And so yeah, today's presentation is mostly going to be covering dormant pruning for grapevines. Hopefully in the future, again, we'll have more opportunities to share more about other canopy management techniques because there's a lot that ends up going into grape production to work with fruit quality. Now I'm just going to stop sharing for one moment here. Okay. And back in. Thank you for your patience. So yeah, my name is Madeline Wimmer. I am a statewide extension educator for the University of Minnesota, and I cover all fruit crops. But thankfully, based on this presentation, my specialty actually is with cold climate wine grapes. So my background is I've been a vineyard manager in the past. I worked at the Missouri Grape and Wine Institute for a while. And I also was a student at UW-Madison working with cold climate wine grapes for my thesis for my master's degree. So I was kind of doing a project with the Northern Grapes Project, and I looked mostly at training systems and crop loads for cold climate wine grapes that you would find in Minnesota, like La Crescent, Brianna, Marquette, and Frontenac. So yeah, let's get started here. And yeah, so today we'll kind of go over grapevine anatomy a little bit to get you an idea of that. We'll talk about why we prune, why it's the first step of canopy management for the year. I'll kind of go through pruning for the first 5 years of establishing a grapevine, which, basically the first 3 years are going to be a little bit different. And then year 4 and after that, you're mainly going to be working on maintaining the vine itself. Pruning mechanics, so talking about different techniques, tools, considerations about pruning, and then we'll kind of go through some takeaway points, summarizing everything, and hopefully have a little bit of question and answer, some discussion at the end. And I just want to start off by saying that grape pruning is very unique. So if you are used to working with trees, it's going to be very different working, with a vine versus trees or blueberries, shrubs, or even just working with like hops, other plants like that. The kind of the rules that you end up using aren't really going to be the same. So with grape pruning, oftentimes you end up taking off about 90% of last year's growth, and you're maintaining that. Just to give you an idea of grapevine anatomy, so here's a picture that you can see, kind of a simple drawing of what I would call a spur pruned grapevine. And you do have a trunk. That trunk is sometimes a double trunk. If you're trying to prune in a way where you have extra parts, oftentimes, which is done in places like Minnesota, you may have multiple trunks. 2 is kind of like the maximum that you really need, unless you're doing a technique called head pruning, which we'll talk about later. But because you end up having usually just 2 arms of the vine, you only really need 2 trunks. So I've talked to some people where they're like, well, I like inherited this vineyard and sometimes there's 3 trunks. And oftentimes that's due to somebody like missing a trunk. Or like they wanted to have more of a renewal area and all of a sudden they just like lost track of it and now all of a sudden you have an extra trunk. So typically there's only 1 or 2 trunks, and that's going to be a very, a permanent wood as long as you're not getting any winter injury in it or disease. And then you have 2 arms of the vine, which are technically called cordons, which for the spur prune type vine, which has permanent wood for these arms, you're going to have that would be more permanent. Whereas with a head prune system, you're oftentimes going to be replacing the arms constantly or year by year. And then you have spurs, which the spur that folks would talk about on an apple tree is very different than a grape spur. So spurs on trees just kind of develop on their own. And sometimes for fruit like cherries, for example, the fruit will only develop on old spurs. And it's the same word, but it's different terminology. In the world of grapes, spurs are basically canes that have been pruned back to about 2 to 4 buds, typically, depending on the training system. And then shoots are the current season's growth. They grow out of buds that are on these 1-year-old canes. Sometimes they break from permanent wood, and you would call that like a water sprout. Sometimes shoots will break from the base of the vine. Those are called suckers, as you can see labeled here. But typically, where you're going to get fruit from are spurs. So 1-year-old wood, which is called a cane, that's going to be pruned back to spurs, which will be a certain number of buds. Those buds will break into green shoots that year that set fruit. So as we walk through this will make a little bit more sense, but I just kind of wanted to give that rundown there. And here you can see a picture, hopefully on your left, of a compound bud. So grape buds tend to be compound buds, which means in this case they have 3 different buds in them. Some grapes actually have more than 3 buds in them, which is really interesting, but typically you have 3 buds. And the primary bud and the secondary bud are going to be fruitful. So basically, these secondary and tertiary buds are kind of like backup buds in case the primary bud ends up dying for some reason, which is really cool. That it's kind of a sign of resiliency with a fruit crop when you have that there. Um, and if you slice open a bud on a cane, you'll typically see something that looks like this. Oftentimes you won't see the tertiary bud because it's like kind of tucked in a little bit lower. You might need to make a few cuts to really see it. But it's important to recognize what the compound bud looks like because part of working with dormant pruning of vines is checking for if any of those buds have been damaged. So get familiar with that. And then you'll hear people talk about buds and nodes interchangeably, and that's partly because a bud exists at every node. So these nodes are basically, if you've ever heard the term internode, that's the space between nodes, but there happens to be that compound bud labeled in B here. At the node region. Oftentimes you'll have a tendril that's opposite to it. Grapes are vines, so they use tendrils to cling onto different materials, which is different than something like a hop or a hardy kiwi, which is a vine, which just rotates clockwise in order to wrap around things. So at the node, you've got the bud, you've got your tendril, and then oftentimes you'll see a lateral shoot breaking out of that area. Not always, but it depends on the vigor of the plant. And then you have a leaf. And that leaf is helping to photosynthesize in order to bring nutrients into the grape clusters as well as the plant. But beyond that, it's really important for grape buds to also be exposed to sunlight, at least the buds that are going to be lower, closer to the fruiting zone, because those buds that are setting during the growing season, when everything is green and growing, those buds are going to be setting the fruit for the following year. And when sunlight hits those buds, basically tells the plant, yes, I'm like on the outside. It makes sense to make fruit here. So sunlight is really important for activating fruiting buds as well. Why would we be pruning grapes, especially as aggressively as we do? Um, Part of it is, so we've got, this idea of rejuvenation here. So flower fruit clusters are produced from shoots that are grown out of that 1-year-old wood. So it grows out of the canes, but we don't want every single bud to be breaking from a cane all at once because otherwise you'd be creating a bush. So we're trying to contain everything and you also don't want things so dense. You don't want you don't want so much fruit to be set on a vine that the fruit quality lowers. And some growers will find out that they've overcropped a vine because they come after, you've had fruit set and all of a sudden you're getting passive veraison, which is the point at which grapes start to turn color. And a grower may notice, okay, like the clusters are not turning color, and it's been a few weeks, and at this point they should be evenly colored, but they're just not ripening as well as they should. And by that point, you can drop fruit and try to make up for it that way. However, it's really best to kind of have a good idea of how to balance the vine before you reach a point like that. So we can talk more about that, but basically pruning is that first step of reducing a large amount of fruit so that you only set as much fruit as the vine can really handle. And then there's, repairing a vine. So frost damage within a cordon, frost damage within a trunk. You may need to replace cordons or trunks at various times in northern climates like Minnesota. And I just have this slide here. This is a picture of a Scott Henry training system. I really liked this training system. It's might be a little bit more advanced to learn how to use it, but it's really good for high density growing when you have vines that are high vigor. And you basically can do a double canopy and crop it. But yeah, the point of this slide is just to say that proper pruning really makes all of this worthwhile. This vine was pruned just as severely as other vines, and you have a great crop of fruit that's growing on here, even coloring. And it's a pretty large harvest from a small amount of area. And then we'll kind of go through the pruning for the first 5 years of establishment. So oftentimes when you're ordering grapes, you'll order them as bare root vines, and you'll receive a bare root vine that has roots coming off of it and likely one, maybe two canes on it. So you'll have these dormant 1-year-old shoots already on there. And old literature used to say that you should always prune back your new vines to about 2 to 3 buds, allow all that energy to go up into it. And maybe that was more important for Vitis vinifera vines, which are the European vines that we tend to not grow here because they're not hardy. But my advice would be to cut your vine back. If there's any really weak, tiny wood on it, cut it back. So pencil-sized diameter wood is about what you're looking for, what John Toole would call like your Goldilocks cane. So you will cut back some of that weak wood, but otherwise you don't need to cut it back to 2 to 3 buds because sometimes that will incite so much vigor that you end up getting a bull cane. And bull canes, we'll talk more about that, but they tend to be really large shoots that have very big internodes, and they're not very hardy because they have the same number of cells, right? So even though they're larger, they tend to have the same number of cells, and those cells are going to be larger, which means that they're more likely to incur frost damage. So that's just kind of helpful to know because, and again, we'll get to a slide that kind of covers that. But during your first year of establishment, you're really focusing on establishing the trunk. And I just kind of have this note in here, this question, I guess, are grape canes like Legos? Because for me, I've always been so fascinated by the fact that you can grow out canes and by year 2 they start getting kind of woody. By year 3 they're really getting more woody, and they're going to keep growing in girth like any other woody plant would. So that's why it can be confusing because it's like that's a trunk, right? And it's like, no, I mean, yes, it's a trunk, but that trunk used to be a cane. Those cordons, the arms used to be canes. Everything was a cane at some point. So that's why I always think, you can kind of look at it like Legos. And again, although I'm giving this talk live, feel free to write any questions in the chat as they come up for you, because that'll be the best way to answer them in the end. So then year 2, you've likely grown up, a few shoots. You're going to select 1 to 2 of those woody shoots known as canes. So you're going to select a couple of them, as you can see here in March. January, February, there's a little bit to prune off. Come March, we've pruned everything back. And then you're going to allow buds to break from the upper part of those 2 canes. And those shoots that grow out are going to become the cordons eventually. And so once again, you don't have to strip off every single shoot. And besides just one for each side, because all of the extra leaves that are on there are going to help the vine photosynthesize and put more reserves back into the woody part of the plant by the end of the year and the root system. So by October, we kind of have something that might look like that. These are pretty basic illustrations, but hopefully it helps a little bit to think about it. And then once again, you're going to be selecting one cordon for each side. So select a cane that will eventually become the cordon. If you're not quite sure how good of quality that cane actually is, you're welcome to select multiple canes to put out. And then once they start to break bud and you know that you have good quality cane, then you can kind of choose what you want at that point. But this year we're growing out shoots, and then you might see a crop this year, but I would advise at that time to either cut the whole crop off depending on the vigor of your vine, or only leave like a quarter crop, like one cluster every other shoot, because you want the vine to be focusing on developing the cordons at that point. And then, October, November, all the vine has gone dormant again, and it's going to look a little bit like this. And I'll take a moment to pause here because I also want to mention that if you were to do head pruning, this is a great example of basically what a head prune vine looks like every single year. So every single year you're choosing canes to put out, and you're doing a full crop, right? So you're going to burn out that cane, but it's okay because you have replacements ready for the next year. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but just to introduce you to that concept. And then finally, this is the first year that you're actually making spurs. So now you're going to be taking all of the canes, likely all of the canes, as long as they're about like a fist spread apart from each other, and you're going to cut them back to a certain number of buds. So the training system I'm showing you here is a high cordon training system. We typically say that you can leave about 3 to 4 or maybe 5 buds on each spur. Ultimately, the goal of pruning in general for the types of vines that we work with in the north is going to be to have about 6 to 8 buds total per linear foot. So as long as you're hitting that 6 to 8 bud approximation per linear foot, you're doing pretty well. And especially because these are new, you shouldn't have any blank wood at that time. So yeah, you can kind of work with that. And then this would be the first year that you have a full crop. And then by year 5, now we're just doing that yearly maintenance pruning where you're going to be you're going to look at each of those areas. So each of those regions has a spur, but now you're going to be basically stacking a new cane that gets spurred on top of that old spur. So you'll likely, right, we said 2 to 3 buds. So that created 2 to 3 shoots, or maybe there's more than that on each node. But again, that same rule is going to apply where we want 6 to 8 buds per linear foot of the cordon. So the way that I want you to be thinking about it is that you're going to be looking at an area, selecting one good cane to become your spur for that year, and you're going to get rid of everything else around that area. So here you can see the April post pruning picture is showing, now we have these spurs stacked on top of the old spurs. And I think that also can be a little bit confusing because it's like, oh, it's a spur. A spur is always a cane that's been shortened back. Well, yes, but then you end up stacking them on top of each other. And sometimes you end up rejuvenating them as well, which again, we'll talk about that. And so year 6 and above, you're kind of just going to be doing the same thing over and over again, unless you need to repair a cordon or a trunk, or make up for blank wood. And this is just a picture of a high cordon vine before it's been pruned. This was at West Madison Agricultural Research Station where I did my thesis project on training systems. And then, so you can see, just look at all of that wood on there, and you can kind of see how these canes got really long, but the ends of them are pretty weak. So that's just helpful to notice. A lot of that has to do with like that wood just didn't ripen very well at the end of the season. And then this is not the same vine, but it's still a high cordon vine. And this shows you how much wood actually came off. And then you can kind of see, right? There's some areas kind of close to the neck of the vine where there's actually been, there is some blank wood. So my hope with a vine like this is that if any buds were to break closer to the neck of that vine, I would probably want to grow shoots out there and maybe at some point create spurs in that area or use them to rejuvenate the vine in the future. So you can start to think about how shoots can be used to actually replace some of that permanent wood if needed. Even just parts of it. It doesn't have to always be the whole thing. And here's just a picture again of before and after pruning, just so you kind of have that comparison all in one screen. And then it's like, oh my gosh, they're real plants. Cool. You have all the shoots growing up at this point. When grapes start to grow, they grow really fast. So it's sometimes, especially when we're in a spring period and we're getting close to buds breaking, you end up getting some bud swell and it stalls, it stays there for a while. But once they really start growing, they grow pretty fast. And here we are at harvest. So you can see this high cordon system, how fruit hangs during harvest. It looks different than the Scott Henry system. Something to think about if you're considering training systems. And then again, this is just that same picture, but just to show, okay, now we're back at winter. So it's going to happen year after year after year like that. So we'll get into a little bit of the mechanics, the basics of pruning. So again, our objectives are to prune canes back to 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 bud spurs, 3 to 4 buds for the high cordon system, 2 to 3 buds for the VSP system where your shoots are going up. And part of that is just because VSP, when you have like vertical shoots and you leave more buds, it's more likely to suppress some of those lower buds close to the fruiting zone. So that's one objective. And then we want to be removing all the other canes that we don't want, as well as hopefully, we will be removing some old spurs potentially as well. And then you want to be making the most spatially efficient cuts by considering cane health and bud direction. So let's go into some of that. And just to mention that pruning is something that I see as an intentional craft. Like honestly, from somebody who's been working with other fruit crops, I think grape pruning is a lot simpler in some ways compared to pruning apple trees. I'm able to give a talk where I can actually give you some guidelines and rules about how to do it. Whereas as I've worked with apples, I feel like there's just a lot more opinions about what should be done, what can't be done, and there's basics to it. But after that, kind of just like makes my head boggle. And when you're pruning grapes, they're very forgiving. So if you accidentally make a cut, oops cut as I'll refer to it as, then you can usually correct anything within 3 years, which is really awesome. So avoid feeling overwhelmed by envisioning the vine post pruning. So see what you want the vine to look like afterwards. And oftentimes I'll tell people to zoom in and then zoom back out again. It's easy when you start to prune, especially if you just start pruning down a row, all of a sudden you've like made some cuts and you're like, why did I do that? I needed that part. So if you're able to kind of zoom in quick, zoom out every time you visit a vine, that can be really helpful. And the more vines you do, the faster you'll just be like, yes, no, no, yes, I want this. Yep, there's that. And you just kind of keep going. So start slow, like anything, start slow, know what you're doing, and then you can really speed up from there. So which canes are you going to select? We started talking a little bit about bull canes. And cane selection is really, based on how long are those internodes. The longer the internodes are that are with you, that you're of the canes that you're going to be making into spurs, the longer your spurs are going to be. And you don't want long spurs because typically you have only a certain amount of space in your trellis that you can hold a canopy. For high cordons, you tend to have more space, but if you're growing VSP, you only have so much space. So you really don't want spurs to be creeping up. And if you have really long internodes, it's just going to happen no matter what. We'll talk about spur creep in a moment here. The shape, the diameter of the cane, the color should be about tan or brown. If it's white, it's likely dead. You'll start to recognize, okay, this really doesn't look healthy. And then if you cut into it and it's brown inside, it's dead. If it's green inside, then it's probably alive. So yeah, I've got the bull cane here, which should be on your left, that healthy cane, which sometimes is called the Goldilocks cane, and then the weak cane, which is going to be kind of thin and spindly. And you don't want something super weak because it won't have the carbon reserves. So carbon's going to be stored in the woody parts of the vines, and that those are the sugars that get pushed out to create the shoots in the springtime. So having really weak canes is not really helpful either. But those bull canes have large cells. Large cells cannot super cool water as much. That's like a whole other concept to talk about, is that super cooling of water. And so they end up getting frost damage more often. And this is just a picture of what some of those diameters of shoots look like if you were to cut them open. All of these are alive, but you can really see the bull cane on the left here, some a little bit more appropriately diametered canes in the middle, and then something that's a little too thin on your right. And this is another picture of a bull cane. So again, this is not really a great choice to be creating into a spur. And you can also see that it's stacked up onto an old spur, whereas the one on the right is coming out of the cordon itself. So both of these are going to be fruitful, but if you're going to just make one decision, I would cut off this bull cane here and then make this into the spur. So you see how we have that one region there, we're cutting one off completely, and then we're reducing the other. And a lot of people will ask, well, is this bud that's way at the bottom close to the fruiting zone, is that going to be fruitful? Do I count that? And the answer is yes. So you would count this here as one bud. There's a bud on the opposite side over here, and then there's this other third bud up here. So you have 3 buds on this cane, and those 3 buds should break and create 3 separate shoots this year. So cane location, watch out for creeping spurs. Again, you see this long old spur here, and you've got a cane coming off of it. You can also see like an old spur that just kind of didn't get pruned off maybe the previous year, which you can always prune that off. But ultimately, you want to prune off this old spur altogether and then choose either this cane on the left or the cane on the right. So yeah, ultimately I would probably choose this cane on the right here. And part of that has to do with how upright it is. So because it's upright, again, you have to train shoots up for a system. This is a VSP system. So you'd be training the shoots up for the season. And if you have a cane that's already upright, it's going to be directing those shoots up. Whereas you might have to fight to kind of get other shoots up into either your catch wires, or you'd have to be tapening those shoots to a single wire. And then, yeah, that's just another example. So again, you'll run into this situation oftentimes where it's like, gosh, like the best cane is the one that's really high up. What should I do? Well, of course, this is obviously so weak. You can tell that this part up here is dead. So I guess I didn't have my pruning cuts there. But if you wanted to, you could cut down this really small one into about a single bud. And then you can choose one of these other canes to make into a spur. So again, it's like, yeah, that top one is really nice. It's really vertical. The internodes are really well spaced out. Because if you look at each of these buds, the direction that the bud is pointing is the direction where the shoot is going to grow. So when you start working with grapes, your mind's going to start thinking more into the future. And whether that's the future this year or 3 years down the road, it's really cool. It's like a really fun, exciting thing to not just be thinking about what's happening right now or within the next month. Um, so these buds are going to be breaking, and you can think about the direction at which those buds are going to break and whether it's going to be helpful to use one of these. So you might want to actually end up choosing this one here because it's nice, and then prune back either one of these canes to one bud, and then hopefully that one bud will create a shoot for the next year. And the following year, you can come back and you can chop off that taller portion. And now all of a sudden, you've kind of rejuvenated that zone. So again, we'll go through spur creep, but more through the lens of this cartoon that I drew. So here's at year 3, you've got that new cordon with one bud coming off of it because the new cordon is a cane. And then you're going to have your shoot growing up. And then by the next year, the next year's dormant season, you have that shoot has gotten woody and now it's the cane. And this cordon is going to have a little bit more secondary growth to it. And you're going to cut it back to, in this case, it's 2 buds. And those 2 buds are going to grow into 2 shoots for your vine. And then you kind of have this choice, just like we were talking about with the previous one. So you can either choose pathway number 1 in red or pathway number 2 in green to become a spur. So pathway number 1 in red is choosing that taller shoot to become a spur, whereas number 2 is choosing the lower shoot, closer to the fruiting zone. And then now we're coming up on another year. We went through that whole thing. Shoots grew out, became dormant. And so pathway 1 is going to be, well, we're always just going to choose that top shoot and see what happens. Pathway 2, we're always going to try to choose the cane that's closest to the cordon and see what happens. So here I got rid of one of the canes and pruned back one for number 1. And then the same with number 2. But you can see how number 2 is really close and compact, whereas number 1 is starting to creep. Year 7, so we're coming up on another year, and I'm going to do that same thing. Again, you can see the result. We're creeping even further for pathway number 1, and pathway number 2 is staying compact. So again, this is an example to show you how spurs can kind of creep up. And with pathway number 1 here, I'd also like to point out that this wood, as it gets older, again, it's going to be less likely that a bud will break from it. It's not completely unlikely, and if a bud does break there, you might want to save it so that you can rejuvenate it and cut off the rest of that old wood the following year, but just something to be aware of. And just one more example here showing the close-up of a pruning of a high cordon vine. So just to show you the age of the wood, you can see your 1-year-old canes here. This 1-year-old cane on the left is coming off of a 2-year-old spur, which is connected to a 3-year-old spur, which is connected to 4-year-old wood of the cordon. And we happen to, on the right, have this cane coming off of here. Whereas on the left, the canes are further out from the cordon. So I have this perfect opportunity to cut off this old cane to cut off this old spur region and to cut the cane back so that I can rejuvenate that zone and keep the spur young and keep it close to the fruiting zone and all of that. And then one more picture here. We talked a little bit about cane direction. So kind of showing here again, you can see your 1-year-old canes coming off of the spur region. And I'm just showing that this one sideways cane, similar to something else that we had seen, may not be the best because of the way that the buds are pointing. But sometimes that's all you've got to work with. So ultimately I can come as an extension educator and tell you all the things that are ideal. Once you have, more than 40 vines, or, you're pushing an acre or even just a half acre, if you'll start doing what you do and you end up doing whatever you need to do to kind of get the job done. There's no, vines are part of biology, just like everything. So they're highly variable, and you end up kind of, take any of the directions that I'm saying as, as much as you can, but ultimately you work with what you can. So here you could cut this off and cut that sideways off completely if you wanted to. And this cane's not good for a bunch of different reasons, but obviously it's being trained for an upward VSP, vertical shoot position vine, and it's pointing downward. So it's already going in the wrong direction. It's something that you would have to fight with. There's this lower wire here only because this is from a system where we had multiple training systems in one row. Typically, you wouldn't have a lower wire there for a VSP system. But again, you would just be kind of fighting with those shoots to try to get them upwards. It's not impossible, but it's just not ideal. And then we mentioned, hold on. I had mentioned lateral shoots and how, within that node region, which is different than a secondary bud coming out of the same node, but you can tell that this is a lateral shoot here because you have this 1-year-old cane, and then you have another 1-year-old cane coming off of the 1-year-old cane. So it's branching from the 1-year-old cane, and you end up some people might mistake it for just another cane. So you would never really want to make a spur out of a lateral shoot like this, mostly because it broke later. It doesn't have as much wood reserves in it. And yeah, it's just not great to do. So there's that diagram again, and that's kind of all I'll say about that. Pruning cuts. So it really, in general, it's good to keep your tools sharp. You want to keep them sterilized. Don't use vinegar. Use isopropyl alcohol or something of that matter to sterilize your tools. And I'm saying know the right tool for the right job. So there's sucketeers. We'll go into the details of that versus like using a pruning saw. Like you wouldn't want to use sucketeers on replacing a whole cordon. You'd want to use a pruning saw. So just kind of knowing what tool you need to use. You'll want to prune about a 1/2 inch above the last bud. So you have your 2 to 3 buds and then you prune right above it. And I've got this note to make a diagonal cut here to prevent water accumulation. That's really only applicable for vertical shoot position systems where the shoots are pointing upwards and maybe you would get that water accumulation. Ultimately, when you do cut something at a 45-degree angle, you're increasing the surface area of the wound that's being exposed to the weather, right? And so ultimately you want, if you could have just a straight cut on it, it would be okay to do that. But less, so if you have that vertical shoot position system, you may end up having water accumulating. So you wouldn't want that. So it's okay to do the diagonal cut. But if you're working with a high cordon system where your shoots are going down, your canes are pointing down, you're not really going to be worried about water. So it's okay to do just a straight cut. And again, like, you don't need every single cut to be perfect. These are just guidelines. And then for older wood, you kind of want to cut it, make sure that you're not leaving like old stubbles on there, which can become environments for pathogens. So here's the tools. I do like the Felco brand. They are generally making bypass sucketeers or bypass pruning shears. You can see this anvil pruner all the way at the bottom right on this left diagram here. And most people like bypass shears. The blade bypasses where where that bottom piece is, because it doesn't really like pinch a branch. It doesn't pinch a cane, which I think in most cases is more important for apple trees rather than grapes. But so you can kind of look into that if you're ever thinking about, do I want an anvil pruner? Do I want a bypass pruner? And then you have loppers here. So this would be an example of a bypass lopper. And those are going to be for more permanent wood. Sometimes they can help you if like you're pruning really tall grapevines. I've done that in the past and that can be really helpful. Um, Before I say anything about electric pruners, which are nice, there are also ratchet pruners, which I think it can be kind of hard to find a good brand of ratchet pruner. I've had a ratchet pruner that lasted for years and then recently purchased one online that broke within like minutes of opening it. So maybe it just had a defect on it. But ratchet pruners can really help because they have a ratcheting mechanism in it. So if you need to make multiple cuts, it can be a little easier on your hand. Electric pruners similarly are going to be easier on your hands because you're not putting all that energy in. And then saws can be really helpful for removing really thick wood. And again, like as you're thinking about working with these tools, do be mindful of your body. Like if you're pruning acres of grapes, that's a lot. And, working out a little bit, like doing some stretches and stuff, I think can be really helpful, or using electric tools to save your body a little bit. And just be mindful too, if you're out there for hours, you want to take care of yourself in multiple ways. So taking breaks is important, and all of that. What are some other considerations? We talked a lot about this throughout the talk, but just knowing your training system and as well as the vigor of your vines and whether, you're going to be pruning back to like about 2 to 3 spurs or 2 to 3 node or bud spurs or 3 to 4 for high cordon systems. Um, this is not the only place where you can control shoot count on a vine. So after those buds break, when they're really tender, if you need to remove some buds because you're like kind of looking at it, it's like, oh, we have way more than 6 to 8 shoots per foot. It's going to be a little bit too dense. You can always come back when they're really tender and just flick them off. So they'll flick off really easily when they're really young. Once they start growing, once they start getting like 8 inches, 6 inches, depending, they can be a little bit harder to remove from the vine. And with that said, that goes for like working, if you have to tie down your canes and the buds are starting to break, you just always want to be mindful because you can easily rub the buds off of your cordons. So something to think about with vine establishment as well. There's so many different training systems. And yeah, it's a lot to think about, but for the most part, people in the upper Midwest are growing on high cordon systems or VSP. I don't know anybody who is using a Scott Henry system. If you're interested in it, please talk to me. But there are these other systems, and there are things like Geneva Double Curtain and Modified Munson, that are like three-dimensional systems. And that's, if you're interested in that, you can kind of go into that. I think a lot of people end up converting back to two-dimensional systems because they're just a little bit easier to take care of. If you have the larger your trellis, the more of your trellis there is to take care of, the more of your trellis you have to pay for to put in. And if you're not really getting good returns on it, then it's not, unless you're just really interested, like I have a dream of making furniture out of grapes. So if you're interested in just doing something because you want to and you don't have a lot of vines, do what works for your goals. So what about just for backyard gardening? A lot of these concepts still apply, but you may, like you can see in this picture here, you may end up having multiple trunks, more trunks than what you would for a commercial vineyard style of growing. So there's many different ways to train a grapevine. Each may be pruned slightly different, but the key concepts still apply. So you're going to be going up on top if you can get up there and hopefully pruning off some of those old canes again or pruning them back to a certain number of buds, which again for systems like this, there's not really as strict of a right or wrong way to do things, but the same concepts apply as wood gets older, it's less likely to break buds. So you kind of want to make sure you keep in those concepts of rejuvenation. And then Are you head pruning or spur pruning? So I alluded to this a little bit at the beginning here, but this is that head pruned vine, which is very different than spur pruning. You don't have permanent cordons. You basically have these two, what I'm calling water sprouts, but they're also, just zones of renewal. So you're going to have spurs that are really close to the trunk, and those spurs are going to supply you with fruiting canes that you lay down every single year. And you can lay down 2 canes on each side, and you basically just exhaust those canes, they fruit, and then you cut them back. And then you don't have to deal with permanent wood, which can end up getting winter injury and trunk disease. So that's why people will adopt this approach. However, you may not get quite as much of a harvest off of head pruned vines, but you can head prune for, upward position shoots, or you can head prune for downward position shoots. And then just to compare, we've been talking about them all evening. This is the spur pruned vine with your permanent trunk, your mostly permanent cordons, and then you have your old spurs and your new cane stacking. And here, again, you can kind of see with this illustration, I've got an old spur with a new spur on it, as well as just a new spur coming out of the cordon. And then this graph, or sorry, this type of drawing, you might see this in other locations too, where some research has shown that the shoot tip is less hardy than the base of the shoot, or the cane. And more recently, I guess I've heard more speculation about this because as research has been going on at UW-Madison and Cornell, they've been taking shoots or canes at various points of the dormant season, and they basically put it in a machine where the temperature drops really low and where they would expect bud damage to occur. And they've seen a lot less bud damage due to external coldness than they anticipated. So there's still kind of this question, and some people are now recommending that the time of the year doesn't matter. So jumping into the time of the year here, where in the past we would say, okay, be really careful because if you prune in the dormant season where you've got this risk of cold damage and all of that, and it's possible that that's less important than we used to think it was. But if you have any concerns of how well your wood sort of ripen, so in the fall, your shoots should be turning woody, and all the leaves should be, getting yellow and falling off. Sometimes you see wood that looks really weak, and if you have sort of that weak wood, then that could lead to, issues where buds have more damage to them. But then, so there's always this question of when to prune. And so grapes are going to go dormant, and then they have this deep dormant period where they have to accumulate a certain number of what's called chilling hours before they start to break bud. Those chilling hours accumulate whenever the temperature is between 32 degrees and 45 degrees. So similar to like the concept of growing degree days where heat units accumulate, we also measure chilling units accumulating. But of course, if it's below that temperature, it's not really accumulating that. And if it's above that temperature, it's still not accumulating that. So you can see how that would be, make it really difficult on a year like this to answer questions about when to prune, when are things going to break bud. However, when the sap starts to run in a grapevine, it's getting closer to breaking bud. And I believe the sap can run for, at least a few weeks. When I've been pruning this past week and the week before, there was no sap running. So that's a really good sign because a lot of people have been concerned about our very warm winter. But we still may end up getting early bud break with grapes this year. And the biggest concern is once you have bud break, grape shoots are going to be very sensitive to spring frost. So that's another topic for a different day. But just something to mention since a lot of people have been asking about it. So here's just a picture of what's called double pruning or long pruning. If you were concerned about deep winter temperatures, but you kind of wanted to get ahead of the game and start to get some of those prunings out of there, because as you can imagine, especially with a system like VSP, when you're cutting all of these canes back, you have to pull all the canes out of the wires, and it can be a big task. So oftentimes when I was a vineyard manager at a place called Cambridge Winery in Wisconsin a few years ago, I had a crew kind of come by and do a rough pruning like this, and then I would go back and do the fine detailed pruning. So that is one method if you're concerned about the deep winter cold damage. And then just a little note here on renewal pruning. This is a vine that I ended up cutting back at in a vineyard years back, and it kind of had this really strange growth. And I think we still aren't really sure like what caused this to the vine, right? But obviously, if you look at the vascular tissue on the left here, you'll see a lot of necrotic tissue or kind of like breaking of that center. So something was happening where it wasn't growing right. And in that case, again, you're hoping that you'll have some canes that are very close to the trunk. So you can always keep those renewal spurs close to the trunk, and then you're going to be pulling new canes just like that third year of production to try to replace them. And again, you can do that even with old wood. So if you have old cordons with blank spaces, you're always welcome to take a cane, hopefully closer to the trunk, and you can pull it over and start to make up for some of that lost space. So here is some cane replacement. You can see we have 3 cordons here, and then that top cane will eventually be replacing. So this is a Scott Henry system, just as a forewarning here, which is why it has 4 canopies. But that top cane here is going to have become the new cane, similar to the one on the left there. And then you've got these 2 permanent cordons at the bottom, and you can see how I have this other cane kind of doubled up just in case I wanted to replace that year. And that kind of makes sense to have that lower one down there. But ultimately, what I would end up doing would probably be to prune that lowest cane back to 2 to 3 buds here, let it grow out shoots, and always have it available in case I need to replace something. But it's so easy to leave so many parts and then you forget about them, and then somebody comes back and they're like, why are there like 4 trunks here? Well, because we got busy and, didn't get back to it. And here's just a really cool picture. This is Woolersheim Winery in close to Madison, Wisconsin. They were training, they had a VSP system and they wanted to train it to be a high cordon system. So they basically, cut back that old wood and took a couple of canes. You can see one is actually a cane, the other one's older. Or maybe they're actually neither of them are canes. But anyway, they took 2 canes at one point and they started training them up, and then they started training them laterally. And the reason why they did that was because they wanted to have a higher fruiting canopy to escape spring frost. So cold air tends to sink, and that can be enough sometimes to make or break whether shoots get cold damage. And so also, just to be said that if you do get cold damage in the spring, it's really important to go back and remember that we talked about that compound bud and how there's a secondary bud and a tertiary bud just waiting to take the primary's place. So even if you get damage to the primary, and there are exceptions of grapes that break both the primary and secondary at the same time. You might see that with some grapevines, but the hope is that if the primary gets damaged, that secondary will take over. It still has fruit. The secondary gets damaged, so the tertiary will take over. It doesn't have fruit, but it will at least be able to photosynthesize to make sure that there's reserves being put back into the plant. And again, this is like one task for the whole season. I think it's one of the most fun things that you get to do with grapes. If you're overwhelmed by it, remember, I would really recommend trying to find a vineyard who you can work with. Not everybody is going to have necessarily the most evidence-based training when it comes to pruning grapes, but at least you can get some practice and you can start to get some feel out of it, and hopefully it'll become something very natural for you after a while. But just remembering again, shoot thinning is there for you. If you end up having too many buds, you can always thin shoots off after they've broken dormancy. Leaf removal is basically where you're going to remove leaves that are close to clusters, not all of them, but you're going to remove some of them in order to expose the clusters and those fruiting buds to the sunlight to help with ripening both the clusters that year and then the buds that need to ripen for the following year, where, to become fruiting shoots. You may at some point be removing clusters if you're looking at a vine and there's too many clusters on it. And then tucking shoots as they grow in a VSP system growing up, as well as pulling apart shoots that are going downward. I would say most growers who are growing on high cordon probably aren't doing this step, but again, it's kind of like how many vines do you have? How much can you focus on fruit quality? Hedging would be summer pruning. So you're eventually with VSP vines, they'll start to grow shoots that are so long that they kind of like hang over. And at some point, you're going to want to hedge those off because, the shoots are shading themselves basically. And then skirting is the same thing, but for high cordon vines. So you don't really want shoots dragging on the ground. They can get in the way of tractor equipment and they're just on the ground, so they're more likely to be moist and gather diseases. And then, yeah, you already have fruit thinning in there. And then by the time that you're in September or August, depending on which variety you're working with, you'll be at a place to harvest. So again, this is just one talk, one part of growing grapes, but I think it's the most interesting, the most fun. So we'll just kind of review here a little bit about key concepts. So grape clusters grow from shoots that originate from centers of growth called spurs, which are made from canes, 1-year-old shoots. Pruning is used to maintain a grapevine shape. We're trying to grow a vine in a very particular shape, not necessarily a bush that's unmanageable. Leaving excess buds leads to an overly dense, unbalanced vine. So not only do you have a very dense canopy that once again has less airflow, so more likely to have diseases, it's not balanced. So you have too many clusters for the amount of vegetative growth. And that means that you don't have enough leaf area to ripen each of those clusters. And there are some formulas out there. So if you know the weight of your prunings, you can use formulas to figure out, how many buds you can technically leave on a vine. It takes a lot of time. It's not something that, can be applied to larger vineyards, but I just want you to know that that's a thing. So we have establishment. Year 1, you'll be getting bare root vines. And just a side note, you may even be trimming some of the roots of your vines if you're getting them in. So if you get vine roots that are like really long, feel free to trim them to about 6 to 8 inches so that they fit in your hole without being in a bunch. So if roots are in a bunch, they'll start to circle around themselves. Again, that's a planting talk, but just in case. So you're going to be growing out shoots that'll become the trunk. And then that following year, you're going to be growing out shoots that will become the cane or the cordons. And then the following year, you're going to be growing out shoots from your cordons that are going to become your spurs. And after that, you're going to be pruning to 6 to 8 buds per linear foot of that cordon or linear foot of your vineyard. And then, yeah, you're just going to be doing that year after year. One mistake I see growers make oftentimes when they're first beginning is that they cut every single spur or every single cane back to a spur, which is too many buds. So you kind of think about it like pick one, get rid of one, cut that other one back. You want to select canes that have medium vigor. The Goldilocks canes, as John Toole would say, they're oriented in the correct direction or the direction that works for your training system, and they're in the right position as well. Use the right tools for the right job, and pruning cuts can be clean and efficient, whatever that means. So, just a message to leave you all here with. Proper pruning promotes a sustainable vineyard. So, with proper pruning, you will have plants that can last for many years. Sometimes you get that polar vortex and everything could die back down to the ground, but hopefully you still have healthy reserves where you'll be able to retrain shoots from the ground back up. The grapes we work with in cold climates are not grafted, which means that any of those suckers that are coming from the ground are true to your vine. So you can always reuse those suckers to make trunks if you need to replace trunks or any other part. The way we manage our grapes influences vine balance and indicates toward what we can expect for vine health and longevity. And so with that, I'll say thank you. And I know I kind of have this open for another half an hour. If anybody has any questions, feel free to write anything in the Q&A. On my end here, it looks like the chat is also active, but yeah, otherwise, I'll just give you all a few minutes here to write anything into the chat, and then we can kind of wrap this up early. I'll be sure to send you all handouts that you would have gotten at the pruning workshop as well, just a heads up. But my email, which I guess I didn't have on the screen there, is wimm0035@umn.edu. So you can always email me there as well. Thanks for taking time to come here tonight. So, if newly planted vines grow two trunks in the first year, do you bend the trunks over to be tapen to the cordon? Or do you cut the head of the trunk to create canes to tie to the cordon wire? So I think, Mandy and Fred, if I'm getting your question right, please let me know if I'm not. But that first year, sometimes people's the shoots will grow so tall that you could technically train them into, skip 1 year and train them all the way into a cordon. So they're gonna, the shoots are growing up from the trunk, they make it to the fruiting wire, they're long enough where you can pull them all the way over. And you could technically use that as your cane or as your cordon eventually. And years back when I was learning how to prune more, again, I'll kind of reference John Toole again. He was somebody who helped me prune a lot better, I would say, in 2015. He always recommended heading them and allowing the lateral buds the following year to become the cordon. So if you wanted to play with that and see what happens, you can do that, but I'm guessing that the reason why it's not recommended is because you may end up, you're kind of asking a lot from just having that one shoot. I guess I don't have a clear answer to it, but I know growers have done both. And I always think it's good to probably head it off and just allow more if you can allow that second year to grow them out, to do that. Otherwise, yeah, otherwise, you can play with that concept a little bit. Did that answer your question? Awesome. Um, oh yeah. Yeah, why are some growers wrapping shoots around the fruiting wire? I made that mistake, I guess like back in 2012 when I started doing this because we didn't, at that time I was an intern and I didn't know as much about what I was doing. Um, it's easy, so it's easy to wrap it and it feels good and it seems like a great thing to do. Um, but ultimately what ends up happening is that you can girdle your vine. So if you have that permanent wood is wrapped around the wire, eventually it's going to kind of like grow around the wire. And I wish I had a picture up here. I think I have in the past where actually like I ended up cutting off a cordon where someone had done that, and you could hardly even get it off because it had like formed wood around the wire. So that can cause girdling. It's not good. I think people do it because it's easy to do that. But ultimately you'll want to use either T-bands, which are like these black rubber bands with like a little hook on them to fasten them. There's other things like egg lock, egg ties, and then tapener can be used as well. But really important to secure your cordons to the wire because especially as they start to fruit, the fruit is heavy and eventually they're not going to stay on the wire. So great question, Mandy and Fred. And then I think if there aren't any more questions, we'll kind of wrap it up here. And yeah, I'll have this recording. I think I'm going to put it on YouTube. So you can always come back to this, and then plan to hear from me again, emailing. I'll email out some handouts as well. So, thank you all for coming today. Again, yeah, having this as a webinar style talk kind of limited our interaction here. Um, yeah, but yeah, have a great evening, everybody, and stay in touch. Feel free to reach out anytime. So thanks for coming, and I'll end it here. Bye now.